Neurons transmit information across long distances using action potentials, rapid, transient spikes in voltage driven by precise changes in the membrane's permeability to specific ions. This created an experimental paradox for early neuroscientists. They knew changes in permeability triggered action potentials, but because those permeability changes are themselves triggered by voltage, any attempt to measure the voltage immediately triggered an uncontrolled cascading action potential. You could not observe the system without setting it off. In the late 1940s, researchers Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley at Cambridge University set out to break this feedback loop. To do so, they required a highly specific biological model, the squid giant axon. At up to 1 millimeter in diameter, this axon was physically large enough for researchers to insert wire electrodes directly inside the living cell. To dissect the microscopic mechanics of excitability, they first had to engineer a macroscopic machine capable of freezing the neuron's electrical state in real time. That machine was the voltage clamp. It allowed researchers to bypass the neuron's natural feedback loops and hold, or clamp, the membrane voltage steady at any desired level. The system operates via a continuous feedback loop. One internal electrode constantly measures the actual membrane potential. An amplifier then compares that internal measurement against a specific command voltage dialed in by the researcher. If the actual voltage deviates from the command voltage, a second internal electrode instantly injects current to compensate. The machine's injected current perfectly mirrors the natural ion current flowing across the cell membrane. By reading the exact output of this compensatory current, Hodgkin and Huxley could directly record ion flow as a function of membrane voltage, isolating cause from effect for the very first time. This line graph plots membrane current over time. When the clamped membrane is hyperpolarized to negative 130 millivolts, we see only a brief, instantaneous capacitive spike, followed by a flat zero line. No continuous ion currents flow. But when the command pulse depolarizes the membrane to 0 millivolts, two distinct ion currents activate. The first is an early, rapid inward current, creating a steep, transient dip on the graph as positive charge floods into the cell. This is immediately followed by a delayed, slower rising outward current. Positive charge leaves the cell, creating a sustained upward plateau that lasts exactly as long as the voltage remains clamped. This scatter plot compares current amplitude against clamped membrane potential. The late outward current rises steadily as voltage increases, but the early current forms a U-shape. It grows, shrinks, and crosses the zero line exactly at positive 52 millivolts. We know from the Nernst equation that the equilibrium potential for sodium in the squid axon is positive 55 millivolts. The disappearance of the early inward current right at this boundary mathematically proves that sodium ions drive the initial influx. To test the sodium hypothesis physically, researchers altered the environment, completely removing sodium from the extracellular seawater bath. These side-by-side graphs compare the standard current against the sodium-free environment. Without external sodium, the electrochemical driving force reverses. The early inward current physically flips into an outward current as internal sodium leaves the cell. The next phase required isolating specific physical pathways. To do this, researchers apply highly targeted neurotoxins, starting with tetrodotoxin, found in certain pufferfish. Plotting the current after applying tetrodotoxin shows the early inward sodium current completely obliterated, while the delayed outward potassium current rises normally. Applying tetraethylammonium yields the inverse result. The delayed outward potassium current is completely blocked, isolating the early inward sodium spike intact. This double dissociation proves sodium and potassium move for distinct, physically separate permeability pathways, the structures we now know as ion channels. Current measures the actual movement of ions, but the underlying physical property dictating that movement is membrane conductance. Conductance represents how many channels are actually open, calculated using Ohm's law. This graph plots calculated membrane conductance over time. Upon depolarization, sodium conductance spikes rapidly, but quickly inactivates, dropping near zero. Potassium conductance behaves differently. It activates with a delay and remains open without inactivating for the entire depolarization. Hodgkin and Huxley combined these empirically derived, voltage-dependent conductance parameters into a single unified mathematical equation. Overlaying the mathematical curve of an action potential onto these timed conductance curves reveals the triumph of their model. Inputting a starting voltage generated a simulated curve perfectly matching the size, shape, and time course of a biological spike. The fast entry of sodium drives the rising phase via a positive feedback loop. The delayed exit of potassium pulls the voltage back down, and its slow turnoff temporarily drives the voltage below resting potential, capturing the undershoot phase. This lingering potassium state, combined with the temporary inactivation of the sodium pathways, perfectly predicts the neuron's refractory period, a brief window where the cell cannot fire again. This derivation mathematically proved that the complex behavior of a firing neuron is fully explained by the precise timing of just 2 permeability changes. Generating an action potential locally is only part of the equation. The signal must travel. Because the neuron's membrane is a poor passive conductor and constantly leaks charge, an electrical signal naturally degrades over long physical distances. The action potential provides an active solution. When localized sodium channels open, positive ions enter. This new positive charge drifts down the interior of the axon, depolarizing the adjacent membrane to threshold, forcing its sodium channels to open, regenerating the action potential. But passive internal current flows in both directions. Why doesn't the signal bounce backward? The answer is the refractory period. In the upstream segment, sodium channels are inactivated and potassium channels remain open, rendering that trailing membrane completely immune to the backward current. The continuous cycle of active channel opening and passive internal charge drift guarantees a one-way all-or-none signal from the cell body down to the terminal. There is a physical speed limit to this propagation. Opening channels, moving ions, and regenerating the signal millimeter by millimeter is a relatively slow process. Vertebrates evolved a structural upgrade to accelerate this: myelin. Myelin consists of multiple dense layers of glial cell membranes that wrap around the axon to serve as heavy electrical insulation. By preventing current from leaking out across the membrane, myelin allows the passive internal electrical charge to travel much further and much faster down the axon interior before degrading. This insulation leaves periodic unmyelinated gaps called nodes of Ranvier. These specific nodes are densely packed with voltage-gated sodium channels. Because active regeneration only occurs at these concentrated nodes, the action potential functionally skips down the length of the axon in a process called saltatory conduction, accelerating velocity from 2 meters per second to 120. This highly efficient design contrasts sharply with the pathology of multiple sclerosis, an autoimmune disease where the body mistakenly destroys the myelin insulation. Without myelin, the passive current rapidly leaks out of the bare axon membrane, and the signal degrades and dies before it can reach the next cluster of sodium channels. From the simple twitch of a muscle to complex human cognition, our entire neurological reality relies on the precise mathematical orchestration of just 2 targeted ion conductances.